Hi, I'm Ashton, and I'm gonna get started real quick, but a couple things first. One, I cut my own hair today. Please don't judge me too harshly. I don't think it looks absolutely terrible. My roommate has left the room for like an hour or two, so I don't know how much time I have, but I have literally not been alone, like by myself, in over a week. So this is a moment for me, and I'm enjoying it. And now I need to film because I really want to film, and I've been wanting to do this video forever, but I haven't had the gosh dang time to film because my roommate is always here. I don't blame him. I'm not actually always here. I was out for like 14 straight hours the other day, but whenever I'm here, he's always here. So this is like a moment for me. All right, cool. Now that we've established that, I know I said in my last video that I want to try out like different places in the room to film. I still do. I have one spot in mind that I think will look pretty cool, but I'm not doing that right now because this is the easiest thing for me to set up. And like I said, don't know how much time I have, so I'm going to rush through this video. I'm not entirely prepared, but I've prepared the vast majority of it. So this is going to be like slightly ad-lib, but also I do have like general bullet points. Today I wanted to talk about something that is close to my heart, specifically leftist literature. Specifically where to start for people that have not read any leftist literature or don't even know what the heck it is. So I asked on Instagram what you guys might have questions about when it comes to leftist literature, so I'm going to answer the frequently asked questions. Then I'm going to get on to some resources that may be helpful for you if you want to start getting into leftist lit. Then I'm going to talk about a few of my recommendations for leftist literature, and then I'm going to talk about books that I have yet to read, but I know are common/popular, and I also want to read them. Then we're going to conclude. Cool? Let's go. Quick side note from editing, Ashton. It takes me a while to get through the FAQ, so check the pinned comment down there for timestamps if you just want to skip to my book recommendations, or if you just want to skip to my reading list in the future. I'll have everything timestamped. Cool. Now that I've got all those logistics out of the way, first a little disclaimer. I'm not like a professional leftist. I'm not a professional video essayist or philosopher or political philosopher or any of those things. I'm just someone that enjoys reading leftist literature and engaging in those conversations both in real life and online. So obviously I have not read everything, and I might leave out a book that you think is really important. And if I do, feel free to tell me about that book in the comments, because I would love to add some more things to my reading list. I got like 60 things to read, but I'm always looking for more. So I am sorry in advance if I skip a book that you see as very important. Let me know if I do. I also wanted to address the fact that oftentimes when it comes to what you've read in leftist spaces, it can become a little bit elitist. I do not by any means believe that you need to have read any or all of these books to be a good leftist or a real leftist. You don't have to read anything in particular to be a leftist. All you have to do is know about the general principles of leftism and what it means, and generally where you fit. You can learn a lot just by joining local organizations or online groups, talking to other leftists that maybe have read things about their opinions and thoughts, even just reading notes and summaries related to the books I'm about to talk about. You don't necessarily have to read them all in full. Not everybody wants to. I get that. So yes, I will be suggesting many books in this video. That is the point of this video. I do not by any means believe that you need to read all of them to be a leftist. You don't. With all of that said, let's move on to part one of this video, which is the FAQ. So I asked on Instagram whether or not you guys wanted to see a leftist reading guide like for beginners, and 91% of you said yes, so that's why I'm doing it, and also because I really wanted to. But I also asked if you had any like basic leftist reading 101 questions, and I got quite a few. A lot of them followed the same themes, so I put them into a few questions that I'm going to answer before we get into my recommendations. The first question that I want to address is kind of two questions, but what is leftism and what is leftist literature? So leftism is a pretty broad term for something that encompasses a lot of different ideologies. If you don't know where you fall in the political spectrum, I would recommend taking a political compass test. I've taken one. Here is my little chart. That's where I am. You may fall further left than me, further right than me, in the middle. I don't know. Maybe you just don't exist on a compass whatsoever. That's cool. I don't care. Regardless, if you don't know where you fall, that test might be helpful, but also there are a lot of things on there that you may not know your opinions about until you actually do some research on it. So comme ci, comme ça, it's not really something that can place you entirely if you don't know your opinions on certain things, right? But it can be a good starting place, especially if you're not sure what ideologies you might want to look into based on the opinions that you already hold. But if you're not familiar with the political compass, this is what it looks like. Down here, or I guess maybe down here for you guys, in one of these corners is the leftist corner. I'll give you a circle. Generally, leftist ideologies aim to cut out social inequality and are against power dynamics in terms of exploitation. Generally, leftists are anti-capitalist, anti-fascist, anti-imperialist. There's a lot of things we're against, but the big overarching theme of any leftist ideology is social equality. That's it. So, if you believe that maybe Jeff Bezos shouldn't rule the world because he has a shit ton of money, you might be a leftist. You might just not know it yet. I believe the term leftist surfaced around like the 1920s, but ideologies that may today be considered leftism have existed a long time before that. Some that you may be familiar with are communism, socialism, democratic socialism, syndicalism, anarchism. All those things and a shit ton more may fall under that like umbrella of leftist politics. Some people are kind of a mix of them, like anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism. There's a whole big broad thing out there of specific leftist politics, but in this video I am more talking about leftism as a whole because this is a beginner's guide. I'm not saying this video is for anarcho-syndicalists only. That's not something that you have to figure out right now. So I guess that's kind of a little leftism 101, very, very concise for you. And leftist literature is any literature that follows those beliefs. Typically, it's nonfiction. Typically, it's kind of wordy. It is a book, a pamphlet, a zine, or whatever it is that points out inequalities, talks about how to solve them, anything that has to do with leftist politics. The first authors that come to mind for a lot of people might be Marx, Engels, Chomsky, Goldman even. There are a lot more than that, obviously, but I'll get into that later. So yeah, leftism, leftist politics, leftist literature, I think that covers the basics for that question. One of the other questions that I got more than once is, have you found any leftist fiction? I have not, but I've actually been reading a lot less fiction than I used to recently, because I have fallen into a deep hole of I want to read every leftist book that exists, and the vast majority of those that I'm aware of are nonfiction. In addition to that, fiction is something that a lot of people interpret differently based on their own experiences and how they read the fiction, but in general, I would say that V for Vendetta is probably a pretty good bet for leftist fiction. It's a movie, it's also a graphic novel. I have not read the graphic novel as of yet. I was going to take it to college, but I fucking left it in my bedroom, so my parents will be bringing it up soon. A lot of people also peg George Orwell's work as leftist. 1984, Animal Farm. A lot of people see Animal Farm as a critique of communism. It's not a critique of communism, just saying. But yeah, 1984, Animal Farm. Even Shooting an Elephant, you could consider leftist, I think. I read Invisible Man somewhat recently. I would consider that vaguely leftist, at least. There's a lot of works of fiction that you could read through a leftist lens, but I don't think there's as many that are like explicitly leftist. Regardless, those are a few that I thought of. If you can think of more leftist works of fiction, please let me know and let the people that asked this question know. Another question that I got multiple times was, where do I start? This video is a great place. But no, aside from that, Marxist.org is a pretty good resource. They have a library section. That said, their website literally looks like I coded it with HTML in like 2009, which is saying it does not look good. Like whoever coded that website, creds to you for doing it and doing the thing, but it doesn't look great. It can be really difficult to navigate, especially the library section, but if you play around with it for a while, you might be able to find something of use to you there. What's worked better for me, and I much prefer, is the Anarchist Library. I'm going to link both Marxist.org and the Anarchist Library in the description, so you can check out both for yourself, but the Anarchist Library, I find, is a lot better organized. Their search function is really helpful. You can find essays related to literally anything you want. They've got the entire Communist Manifesto. I believe they have all of Das Kapital, which I'll talk about later as well. It's also available in multiple other languages, I think about 10. I'm not sure which ones, but if you go to the English website, there's a button at the top where you can click a drop down and there's a list of other languages the website's available in, so it's accessible to multiple different language speakers. I find their search function really easy to use. You can search by category and by sub-genre of leftism, if that makes sense. So yeah, their search function is really great. They also have a randomization feature, which is honestly just kind of fun. If you feel like reading something leftist but you don't know what to read, randomize it. I read a 3-page essay this morning on the anarchism of anti-slavery movements. which was a really interesting article that I wouldn't have found if I didn't use that randomize button. So I'd encourage you to just like play around with that website a bit, hit that randomize button, search for something you're interested in within leftist politics, and just take it from there. I'm also going to be mentioning the Anarchist Library a couple times later in the video because some of the books that I recommend are also on that site. So we'll be back. Put a pin in that guy. The last few questions that I got a lot of are, can you recommend any books that are like common language, like aren't too difficult to read, and books that are accessible price-wise? Both of those things I will have addressed in my ratings of each book that I'm recommending to you. And we're going to get into that right now, I guess. So the next section is books that I've read and would recommend to you. So for each leftist-aligned book that I have read and am recommending, I'm going to give you 5 ratings out of 5. 1, a rating for accessibility. Is it available online? Do you have to buy it? Is it expensive? That sort of thing. The second one is out of 5 for readability. How technical is the language? How complex is the sentence structure? How long is it? Can you get through it easily? Is it easy to read? Then out of 5 for content. How interesting is it? How cohesive is it? And then out of 5 for impact. How much did it impact me? How much did I enjoy it? Like, how common is it in the sphere of talking about leftism? Like, are you going to go into a local meeting of leftists and are they going to know about this book, right? Like, is it a book that is commonly discussed within leftist politics? That was a lot to say a little bit, but you know what I mean. And then all of those I'll average together for a final, out of 5 rating type thing that I'm going to also pop on the screen. I'm going to do some fun editing in this video. It's going to take me a long time. So the first thing that I want to recommend, you knew this was coming, is the Communist Manifesto. I know, it's not red, shocking, but it comes in all sorts of colors. You could probably get a rainbow Communist Manifesto if you wanted to. I'm sure that exists somewhere. If not, I'll sell it. So the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels may be an obvious recommendation, but I feel like a lot of people joke about this book or talk about it in an offhand way, but it actually is a useful thing to read, especially for beginning leftists. It is short, despite how thick this book is. The actual manifesto is about this much. It's 30-something pages. You can get through it in a day, in an hour. The version that I have also comes with a bunch of prefaces and other things written by Marx and Engels, including the 18th Brumaire, or how the hell do you pronounce that? A bunch of different things that are related to the manifesto but are not the manifesto themselves. So the manifesto itself is only about 30 pages. I'm giving it a 5 out of 5 for accessibility because it is all on the Anarchist Library, and you can also find it pretty cheaply at a lot of different bookstores. This my boyfriend bought for me, but the back of it says $6.95 in the US, $8.50 in Canada, so it's not a super expensive thing to read. It's probably in a lot of different university libraries or even just normal public libraries because it is a very political philosophy 101 book. Again, I know this may look intimidating. This whole thing is not the Communist Manifesto. The manifesto itself is very short. You can find it all online. I would recommend you read it. As for ratings, I'm giving it a 5 out of 5 for accessibility because you can find it in a lot of different places and it is cheap if you do want to buy it. I'm giving it a 3.5 out of 5 for readability because it is short, but it may use language that you don't entirely understand. But because it is one of the core leftist writings, a lot of the language in here you're going to find throughout a lot of other leftist literature. And once you familiarize yourself with it, possibly through the manifesto, you'll be a lot more familiar with it for the rest of your readings. And, any word that you don't understand, you can look up online. You can get a version with a glossary. You can get a version with an index. I found it relatively easy to read, and I was on heavy pain meds the first time I read this because I was straight out of top surgery. I'd give it a 4 out of 5 for content. A lot of the things that they reference obviously are not entirely relevant today because it was written quite a long time ago, but a lot of it still applies, and because it is the Communist Manifesto, a lot of people in leftist spaces are going to talk about it. And I would give it a 5 out of 5 for impact because it was technically the first full-on leftist piece of literature that I read, and I still to this day would recommend it to beginning leftists. So if you add all those ratings of mine together, you would get a 4.375 for the Communist Manifesto. That is my official rating. Thank you very much. Moving on from that classic to a book that I read a lot more recently. Where is it? I've got 7 books here. Antifa, The Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray. This is a very recently published book. It's not by any means a classic of leftist literature, but it does give a really good comprehensive history of anti-fascism as a philosophy, and it goes more deeply into what that means and why it's such an outright philosophy. It addresses a lot of the counter-arguments that a lot of liberals or centrists would have against anti-fascism. Specifically, if you are new to anti-fascism, or if you're super interested in leftist history, specifically anti-fascist history, I would definitely recommend this one. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm not a history person. The title is a bit of a misnomer. It's not really a handbook in the sense of like Black Blocs 101, how to turn a bandana into a face mask. It's not going to teach you that stuff, but it is going to teach you the basic and a bit more in-depth of the rhetoric of the anti-fascist movement, how you can get involved. Generally, it points you in the right direction with anti-fascism and why it's such a prominent thing in leftism as a whole. I'm giving it a 2 out of 5 for accessibility because it's not exactly expensive. It is a paperback. I don't know. I believe there is a hardcover version, but I have the paperback, so I'm not sure. It wasn't like a $20-$30 book. It was $15, I think. And you could probably get it secondhand. You could probably find it in the library, but it is not on the anarchist library, probably because it is a much more recent book. You know, it's not the Communist Manifesto that's distributed literally everywhere. It's not inaccessible, but it's not the most accessible book that is on this list, so I'm giving it a 2 out of 5. I'm going with a 4.5 out of 5 for readability. I found it very easy to read, and again, I'm not a history person, and this book was very history heavy, but I still really enjoyed it. If you are a history person, you'll probably find it extremely easy to get through, and I also don't think it's a book that you necessarily need to read all the way through. If you're not so much interested in like a specific time period of anti-fascism, you can skip that chapter. It's not necessarily like a super linear thing. You don't have to read chapter 2 to understand chapter 4. If you're looking for something specific, the table of contents is pretty helpful with that. So you don't need to read all of it, but if you are interested in the history or ways that you can get involved in anti-fascism or like the inner workings of the movement in a sense, this is definitely a good read. So I'm going with 4.5 out of 5 for readability because I read all the way through it and I don't like history. So if you do like history or if you are super interested in anti-fascism like I am, you're gonna love it. I'm going with a 5 out of 5 for content because, as I said, I hate history, love this book. It was introduced to me through a video essay on anti-fascism by Ollie Thorne, philosophytube. It is a very good video. I know it's long, it's like a movie, but like if you can watch the 4-hour whatever Avengers movie that came out recently, you can watch that video. I sat all the way through it in one sitting. It is a really good video. If you're still like wishy-washy on anti-fascism, again, that's a really good video. I'm gonna link that actually because you're gonna get a lot of information out of that you wouldn't necessarily get out of this book. I think they're pretty separate. Anyways, I'm giving it a 5 out of 5 for content. I found everything in it very interesting and very informative, and I feel like I'm a lot more educated on anti-fascism, not only as a philosophy, but as a historical movement as well. I'm giving it a 4 out of 5 for impact because it is new. It's not really like something that you hear discussed a shit ton, but it is something that I've heard brought up a couple of times, even in that philosophytube video. And I think it is a good book for leftists and like liberals, centrists alike, because it definitely addresses some of the more common counter-arguments to anti-fascism as a movement. I wouldn't say that it pushed me any further left because I was already pretty on board with anti-fascism, but it definitely gives you a lot more context and I still learned a lot. So if you average that all together, my rating for the Anti-Fascist Handbook is 3.875. That is mainly due to its accessibility issue. But once again, I do think it is definitely worth checking out in the library, seeing if a library near you has it, borrowing it from a friend. I'm gonna give this one to my boyfriend to make him read it. But yeah, overall, very good book. Almost forgot to mention, this book also has a lot of like references in the back of like websites, organizations, other books that you can read about anti-fascism, so it's really good in that sense that if you use this as a jumping off point to learn more about anti-fascism, you're gonna have a good time. So, yeah. That. Next on my list is Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his last name, but this is a personal favorite of mine. I read it twice, like as soon as I finished reading it, I read it again. Freire was a really interesting dude as a whole, and this book does include, like, at the beginning, a brief-ish history of, like, him as a person and his actual work outside of writing stuff like this. This book in particular has to do with the obligation that people have to educate those that remain, in Marx's words, like under the chains of capitalism, right? It has to do with ethical obligations and education and how that education can happen, and actually talks a lot about praxis as opposed to theory, which I really appreciate. I read this book because a leftist that I follow on Twitter made their display name read Pedagogy of the Oppressed for like 6 months. So I added it to my Goodreads list, and I saw that one of my friends from marching band who graduated like 2 years before me had read it, and I messaged him like, hey, what'd you think? And he was like, well, hear my thoughts. And we talked about leftism for a while, which was weird because like he didn't like me when we were in marching band, but whatever. That said, I'm gonna give it a 1 out of 5 for accessibility. This copy, which I believe is the most like popular like publication of the piece, was like $35, which is like textbook levels expensive. It's not that big, right? I had a gift card, so that's why I got it. It may be available at libraries. It is not on the anarchist library, which sucks, but like I get it. If you can find it at a library, if you can borrow it from a friend, I would highly recommend reading this. I learned a lot from it, but it does get a 1 out of 5 for accessibility for me. I'm giving it a 3 out of 5 for readability. I didn't have an issue reading it, but I did enjoy it a lot, and for someone that isn't as interested in like ethics and education, you might not be as interested in it. It does use a lot of big words, but again, if you just look them up, you'll be fine. So 3 out of 5 for readability, purely because it does get repetitive in parts, but I do think it is still an important read. And I would recommend it regardless of its possibly slightly difficult reading level. You do get a lot of like footnotes and such, which can be really helpful if you're looking for resources on like where this language comes from and like what other books you might want to read to like give yourself some background. I like books with footnotes. I don't know why, they just give me like a fulfilled sense, I'm giving it a 5 out of 5 for content and a 5 out of 5 for impact because, as I said, I read it very recently and I read it like twice in a row. I really, really liked it. I can't even explain why. I just really enjoyed it, and I would recommend that you read it. I would like to note, though, that this may be better for slightly more advanced beginner leftists. Like, I wouldn't say you should read this before anything else. I would say start with the manifesto and start with the next one that I'm going to talk about, actually, but this is still definitely a good book for when you're getting into leftism. It doesn't have to be read only by, like, super academic people, Next on my list is Anarchism and Other Essays by Emma Goldman. I don't have a copy of this one because I actually read it on the Anarchist Library, so this is one that I read a long time ago. I do kind of want to revisit it soon, though, because it's been a while, and I remember really, really enjoying it. If you are interested in anarchism at all, or, like, actually understanding what anarchism is, as opposed to the whole, like, anarchy in the UK thing, that a lot of, like, liberals and centrists talk about but don't really understand, Emma Goldman is a really good place to start. It definitely gets 5 out of 5 for accessibility. It's right there on the Anarchist Library. I don't have a copy of it. I would love to have a copy of it because it's definitely one that I would love to highlight through, but I don't. I'd say it gets like a 2 out of 5 for readability. I remember hating reading it on the Anarchist Library because, like, it's all on one page, right, and it's 12 chapters. It's not, like, exceedingly long. It's not Das Kapital, but like a preface and a mini biography of her before you actually get to her writing. I would just recommend you skip that part unless you do want to know a bit more about her. The biography is like a lot of names, a lot of places, a lot of dates, and I'm not a history person. I just wanted to read her actual writing, so that's what I did. But because it's all on like one web page, it's kind of hard to scroll through sometimes, figure out where you left off. So I like left it open the whole time I was reading it and like scrolled little by little. So 2 to 5 for readability, just because that aspect, the Anarchist Library, it's good, but it's a format that doesn't always work for everybody. And also because it was written in 1910, so some of the language is like antiquated, not language that we'd use anymore necessarily, but it's still very, very good, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I didn't have an issue with any of the vocabulary or anything, but once again, looking up words is not something that's shameful. The sentences are definitely a bit more complex than like something like the Anti-Fascist Handbook, but it's still definitely worth getting through it. Also, kind of similar to the Anti-Fascist Handbook, it is like different essays, and if you just want to read anarchism, what it really stands for, chapter 1, you can do that. If you want to skip to the essay on prisons or women's suffrage, you can do that too. It's not something that you have to read in order, which is nice, and the Anarchist Library does have it so that like at the top there's the table of contents, so you can click on the essay that you want to read, so that's nice. I believe I read all of them except for the one on Puritanism, I think, if I remember correctly. I may be wrong, but I can't speak to that one. But all the other ones I remember really enjoying. So where was I? 5 out of 5 for accessibility, 2 out of 5 for readability. I'd give it a 5 out of 5 for content. It's well organized, at least on that website, and I'm sure in, print format it is as well. The essays are all relatively well understandable, at least for me, and it's something that I feel you could easily look up if you didn't understand a specific concept or word, but especially the first essay, it's a very, very good introduction to anarchism. I absolutely adore her style of writing, especially because she is one of the first, like, prominent woman anarchists. a lot of the things that she writes are about women's suffrage in relation to anarchism and, you know, liberation of gender and such, which is cool. I love it. So I would definitely recommend Emma Goldman, not just Anarchism and Other Essays, although that is a lot of her writing right there. The Anarchist Library as a whole has a lot of Emma Goldman, so go read some of her. I would give it a 4 out of 5 for impact, just because I knew enough about anarchism before I read it that nothing was like mind-blowing to me, but I can definitely see someone that's new to leftism like really learning a lot from it. I still learned a lot from it, and I already knew the gist of what anarchism is. So averaging all those ratings together, Anarchism and Other Essays by Emma Goldman, excluding the one about Puritanism that I didn't read, gets a solid 4 out of 5 for me. Once again, it's not something that you necessarily have to read all of. Just the first chapter is a real great introduction to anarchism. And you could literally pick anything that Emma Goldman has read and probably enjoy it if you like similar styles of writing that I do. So yes, Emma Goldman would recommend. Okay, last actual book in this section, then like a couple general things, is Don't Let My Past Be Your Future by Harry Leslie Smith. I believe this came out in like 2017. Yeah, 2017. He was 94 when this came out, but dear Lord, this man has lived through so much. This is both like a memoir and a little bit of political philosophy. It's definitely more of a like democratic socialist book, but that is still leftism. Maybe I'll make my boyfriend read this one because he's into democratic socialism. You know, Francis O'Grady calls it a must-read for trade unionists, campaigners, and everyone on the left. So clearly you have to read it. It is a requirement. No, it's not. Harry Leslie Smith is like a very passionate person, and he has a lot of life experiences. Obviously he's 94, but like he grew up in extreme poverty. He fought through a war. I have not finished this book. I'm about like 10 pages from finishing it, so I feel I can give a relatively full review. He gives a lot of his life story in this book and talks a little bit about the ways that you can construct a government for it to be more fair for people of all incomes, and why he feels that that's necessary. And because this was also published around the rise of Trump, he talks a lot about that and why people may be drawn to white nationalism and fascism and stuff, and it's a very good insight from someone that has a lot of life experience. And because, again, it is more recently published, it's very easy for someone of my age, 18, to read, right? It talks a lot about poverty, housing crisis, hunger, all the things surrounding poverty. It's very interesting, and especially because I grew up in like an upper middle class household, I'm very privileged with that, and this definitely gave a more like personal individual insight to a side that I never had to experience. I have not found it on the Anarchist Library, but it's £9. Not sure how much that is in US or Canadian dollars, but £9. 2.5 out of 5 for accessibility. Not expensive, but I don't think you can find it online for free. As for readability, I would give it like a 4.5 out of 5. I would say a 5. I have read a lot of memoirs. I really like memoirs, and this one just jumps around a bit too much for my taste. Because it is like a political philosophy / memoir, I totally get why he does that, and it's still easy to read. It just wasn't my favorite, so I hesitate to give it a 5, but 4.5 is still pretty damn good. And if you're more interested in democratic socialism than like fully automated communism, then this is also a book for you. As for content, solid 5 out of 5, really enjoyed it. I have no complaints as for content, and impact, I would say 3 out of 5 for me, but that is based on the fact that I'm definitely more of a leftist than Harry Leslie Smith is, so this didn't like radicalize me at all. But if you are a centrist, a beginner leftist in a way, then this will definitely be a good book for you, and it is like shortish, pretty easy to read, very like beginner leftist friendly in terms of its language and the terms that it uses and talks about. So while it was just a 3 out of 5 for me, for a beginner leftist like who I'm assuming is watching this video, it'll definitely be a good read. My legs are completely fallen asleep. Overall, that gives this book a rating of 3.75, but again, that may be higher if you are someone that is not as radical as I, or a beginner, so keep that in mind. Moving on to a book that a lot of people, I feel like, would recommend, like as like necessary leftist shit, but I wouldn't necessarily, is this bad boy, Das Kapital. It is textbook level, right? This is a thick-ass book. And yes, I read the whole thing, and let me tell you, you don't need to. Now, it isn't actually like as long as it looks because there's a lot of footnotes and prefaces and afterwards and such, but it is still very thick, and this is only volume 1. There's 3 volumes, one of my life goals. I will one day read all 3 volumes, but that day is not today. I know, it's by Marx, and I'm not recommending that you read it. Who am I? But for a beginner leftist, I would not say this book is for you. I feel like I read it too early on in my leftism journey. I don't regret reading it. I'm glad that I did. And if you're someone who loves a thick book, man, go for it. I'm not going to stop you. But if you're a beginner leftist, if you feel like something like the Anti-Fascist Handbook or Don't Let My Past Be Your Future is more your pace, then this is definitely not for you. You know, he's got formulas in here of like profit, and I definitely learned a shit ton. Like, this is so much knowledge, and I'm glad I read it once again, but I wouldn't say it's a beginner book. I would say if you're super into leftism and you want to read more Marx, fucking go for it. I'm not stopping you, but I'm not going to recommend it to beginners. Again, this is volume 1. There's 2 more of these bad boys. But if you want like an in-depth understanding of a lot of Marxist theory, this is really good. But it is complex. It is long. Wouldn't recommend it to a beginner. Okay, one last thing I have to recommend to you before I get on to the next section, and that is books about people that are not you. Okay. So if you are a white leftist, read books by and about people of color, and essays by and about people of color, pieces in general by and about people of color. The Anarchist Library is a real great source for this. You can look up POC, and there's dozens and dozens of articles, essays, like full-ass books on theories related to the intersectionality, and like there's just so much information, and you should do that searching on your own. I'm not going to necessarily recommend like one specific thing because that is so broad. So like, you know, white leftists read things about people of color. Cishet leftists, you should read things about queer people. Abled leftists read things about disabled people. I would say like find a books, essays that expose you to intersectionalities and axes of oppression that you don't understand in a personal sense. A book that I'm reading right now that was edited by my friend Theo is Ex-Marxist Bot. It is so good so far. I'm not that far into it, but I absolutely love it. I'm gonna do a trans book review on this, but if you are not non-binary, this might be a good place to gain some empathy for non-binary people, especially if you are a binary trans person, because we do share a lot of things, but it's not the same experience. And I'm not going to get too far into it because I'll save it for the review of this, but my general message is if you are cisgender, read something by a trans person, and by non-binary trans people as well. Something that I would also recommend if you have like one specific marginalized identity, like for me, my transness and my gayness and my queerness as a whole, as well as like mental health stuff and also, you know, chronic physical pain, whatever else, read something that is an intersection between your marginalized identity or like beingness and someone else's. So for me, that is this book, Queer Poets of Color. This is all poetry by queer people of color, obviously, like that much poetry. For poetry, that's quite a bit. There are dozens of poets highlighted in this book. I have read the vast majority of these poems. I don't think there's one that I haven't read, but it's possible because I kind of skipped around a bit. But as you do in an anthology, one of the big like facets of leftism as a whole is empathy for marginalized groups and understanding like social equality and egalitarianism and all of those related things. So if there's a marginalized class that you are not a part of, read things by that marginalized class and understand where they're coming from. Obviously, you can't understand fully oppression that you haven't been through, but getting empathy for that and listening to people that have written things about that with their labor and with their time, like, you should read it. I know it's not leftist theory, it's not Marx or Goldman, but I still think it's a really important facet of leftism that we shouldn't ignore when talking about like beginner reading. Obviously, I don't know you personally, so I don't know what identities you do and don't have, but search for things by people with identities different to yours and identities overlapping with yours, but also with different things with them, if that makes sense. Cool? Cool. That's all my recommendations. That was more than I thought it was. Like, it felt like a lot, even though it wasn't that many books. I say as I have like, oh dear. Obviously, as I said before, I have not read anything. There are probably things that I left out. That being said, there's a lot that I still want to read. I went through my to-read list and I picked out the leftist specific ones as things that maybe you want to jump off into, so these might be some good starting points. Maybe these are shit books. Obviously, I cannot vouch for any of these because I have not read them, but they are on my to-read list, and maybe one of them will catch your interest, so I'm going to read out my leftist to-read list, things that I will hopefully read within the next 3 years. There's a lot of books on here. I can't recommend them to you or tell you how accessible they are or how readable they are or what their content is like because I have not read them, but I hope to. And I'm sure there are other people who have reviewed those books out there somewhere. These are all books that other leftists have read, recommended to me, or books that I've found on my own and I really want to read. I will read all of them someday, but for now I can't vote for them, but I can give you their titles and their authors and set you off on your own path of leftist reading. I'm going to just read this off a list because it would be ridiculous for me to, like, try to memorize a giant list of books. All that being said, the following is a list of books that are on my to-read list and have either been recommended or referenced by other books that I have read. Let's go. I also realized that I might be talking really fast because I'm kind of in a rush because I've been filming for an hour and my roommate's going to be back any day now. Well, any day, any moment now. But I'm going to try to slow down my voice a little bit for this so that you can get these titles down. I'll also put this list in the description, not with any links, just so that you can search it on your own. Manufacturing Consent by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate by Naomi Klein. Four Futures, Life After Capitalism by Peter Frase. Mutual Aid and the Conquest of Bread, both by Kropotkin. Building the Commune, Radical Democracy in Venezuela by George Ciccariello-Maher. Anarcho-Syndicalism, Theory and Practice by Rudolf. The Betrayed Revolution by Leon Trotsky. The State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. Sex After Fascism, Memory and Morality in 20th-Century Germany by Dagmar Herzog. Heavy Radicals, The FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists, The Revolutionary Union / Revolutionary Communist Party, 1968 to 1980 by Aaron J. Leonard. Spaces Between Us, Queer Settler Colonialism and Indigenous Decolonization by Scott L. Morgenstein. On Anarchism by Noam Chomsky. The Antifa Comic Book, 100 Years of Fascism and Antifa Movements by Gord Hill. Direct Action, Protest and the Reinvention of American Radicalism by L.A. Kaufman. And True to the Earth, Pagan Political Theology by Cadmus. There we go. That's my list right now. I'm always adding to it. Help me. All right, with that being said, I'm done. I hope this video wasn't, like, terribly long, although I already know it will be. This is going to be... All right, here's my guess, all right? I'm going with 25 to 30 minutes is my guess for this video. If I'm right, then you'll know, but I won't until I edit it. Anyways, I hope that this was everything that you hoped it would be if you're a beginner leftist, and if you have read a lot more of leftist lit than me, please tell me what your favorites are, or if something that I recommended is like your least favorite book of all time, let me know. I hope that I answered all those FAQ questions relatively well, and I hope that I wasn't talking too fast in this video in the hopes that I will finish before my roommate gets back, which I did. So anyways, thank you for watching all the way to the end. I highly appreciate you. Goodbye. If you are beginning in leftist philosophy, I hope you find your place, and I hope you find a political ideology that makes you feel good about life and optimistic, because the world is dying and we don't have that much time to change things. I love you, and I'll talk to you later, maybe.